It is time we stop funding the military-industrial complex whose profit is based in conflict and annihilation. That is not an investment in our future. It is an invitation to destruction.
The U.S. Congress passes its annual defense bill, almost $770 billion, as progressive Democratic lawmakers try but fail to reduce America's growing military spending. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhry. The United States has had, over the last 75 years, the largest defense budget in the world, and it keeps growing. Last week, the U.S. Senate passed what's been described as the largest military spending bill since World War II. The Defense Appropriations Act authorizes over $768 billion in funding for defense and national security, $25 billion more than President Biden had requested. It's a 5% increase from last year's defense budget and 6 times higher than the administration's proposed $131 billion in healthcare discretionary spending. Many here in the United States are asking why, as the U.S. continues to grapple with a pandemic that has already killed over 800,000 Americans. Aside from domestic defense demands, a major source of revenue for the U.S. military-industrial complex is the global arms sale. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, the United States accounted for 37% of global arms exports from 2016 to 2020. And 24% of U.S. arms exports went to one single country, Saudi Arabia, with some members of Congress strongly opposed to the Saudi-led war in Yemen, which is now in its 7th year. A war estimated by the United Nations to have killed over 377,000 people. But dissenting voices in the U.S. Congress have failed. An amendment to the defense bill to stop U.S. backing for the Saudi-led war in Yemen was defeated. And on the same day the House approved its compromise defense bill, the Senate voted down a draft resolution that would have stopped a $650 million arms deal with Saudi Arabia. Joining me now is someone who has been a critic of U.S. defense spending and whose organization Code Pink is at the forefront of trying to stop U.S. military support to Saudi Arabia. Marcy Winograd is coordinator of Code Pink Congress. She served as a 2020 Democratic National Committee delegate for Senator Bernie Sanders. Marcy Winograd, almost 70% of the Senate voted against a resolution that would have stopped a $650 million arms deal to Saudi Arabia. That included many Democratic senators, in fact, many of whom were saying how outraged they were when the Trump administration made arms deals with the Saudis. Should we be surprised at all?
Yes, we should be surprised, given that President Biden campaigned for the presidency on a platform that called for cutting those arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, given the assault of the near genocide in Yemen. So, yes, we should be surprised that President Biden has gone back on his word in that respect. In terms of the Congress, I think Democrats are very reluctant to challenge a sitting president who's also in their party, and that's one of the problems. However, at Code Pink, we are hopeful that this is going to come back, this issue. There are Congress members who want to reintroduce this, and so the debate is not over yet. I think under Biden, we've seen something like $1 billion in arms sales to the Saudis and the UAE. And we know that children are dying and facing starvation in Yemen, and it's just inexcusable. So at Code Pink, we continue to push on this, and we have to remain optimistic. It's really a matter in Code Pink Congress of reaching out via our constituents to everyone that we can in Congress.
And as you say, President Biden himself pledged to make human rights the center of his foreign policy. In fact, just last February, less than a year ago, he said the United States would cut off support for, quote, offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales. Is this administration just playing semantics to justify this continued military support for Saudi Arabia?
Absolutely. This is a game of semantics. It's not a very funny game either. They say they are not going to sell offensive weapons, and yet when you sell, quote, defensive missiles, you're in essence defending a blockade. You are backing up a blockade that prevents medicine and all sorts of necessary supplies, fuel, from entering Yemen. And so you can say it's defensive, but we know there really aren't any weapons that are defensive.
Yeah, are there any such thing? I was just going to ask, any
Yeah.
such thing as defensive weapons? But when you have the senior Democrats in Congress, like the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez, voting to allow this arms sale to go through after criticizing the previous administration for being, quote, all too happy to sell to the Saudis, when their justification is that these weapons don't constitute offensive weapons, when we know they do, and when they say that the Biden administration has largely suspended the sale of offensive weapons, what do we make of it? I mean, how much truth is there in any of this?
That's a good question. I think it begs progressives, everyone who's involved in politics on the ground, to put a lot of pressure on people like Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey, who's, as you mentioned, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. Also, Adam Smith, who in the House chairs the Armed Services Committee. Jack Reed from Rhode Island, who chairs the Armed Services Committee in the Senate. All of these people are culpable. And from my perspective, Biden is running scared. You know, he's frightened of them, and they are dictating our foreign policy.
But what does he have to be scared of? Why would he be so frightened of his
You know,
fellow
it's
Democrats?
it's a delicate balance. Biden, it doesn't look very hopeful today as we talk, but he's been pushing for this $1.9 trillion Build Back Better bill to expand Medicare to include dental and vision, tuition-free college, climate, sustainability, and he needed every vote. He felt, I think, that this was not something he was ready to take on if it jeopardized his Build Back Better. But as we see now, one of the senators who's needed to vote for that, Joe Manchin from West Virginia, has announced on Fox television to a Republican audience that he is not going to vote for it.
Well, it's a very fine line that Biden is having to tread. And just how much influence do progressives have, people like Bernie Sanders, when you look at the dynamics that are going on in Congress?
Well, again, a good question. I think that at some point we have to really take a stand. I mean, Bernie Sanders is chair of the Senate Budget Committee, so everything has to go through his budget committee. And even though he is not chair of the Appropriations Committee, that's his fellow senator from Vermont who has announced that he is retiring, Patrick Leahy. Yesterday was on the phone with Bernie Sanders' office saying, can you stand with Patrick Leahy and refuse to appropriate the money for this National Defense Authorization Act, which is the military budget, $778 billion that just flew through Congress. You know, here we are months into this debate over Build Back Better and addressing the urgent needs at home, and yet you want a military budget that's $25 billion more than Trump? Easy, no problem.
But of course, as you say, I mean, there's so much that this administration could be doing to spend money on social welfare programs, yet billions of dollars are going to the Defense Department, far more than it's actually requested or that the administration had requested, that could go to social programs that could benefit Americans at home.
If it were up to me and I were President Biden, I'd be signing executive orders right and left to forgive student debt, federal moratorium on evictions. I mean, we're looking at many more homeless hitting the streets without some sort of remediation here. You know, there's always money for the military in large part because it's a jobs program. You know, people say we don't want socialism in the United States. This is a socialist program, the military. You know, all these bases, 750 bases, all these troops we've deployed, the health care they get, the education that's given to these troops. This is what we call a socialist jobs program. Only the problem is, as we know, that militarism exacerbates the climate crisis. It's a threat multiplier, right? It is the largest, the Pentagon is the largest in the world, single emitter of greenhouse gases. And I'm involved in both Code Pink Congress and Veterans for Peace, and we've been trying to highlight these linkages.
And you mentioned socialism. Some would argue socialism for some. For the defense contractors, certainly it is socialism. But for for the rest of the American public, I don't know if the jobs creation is something that really matters that much to them.
Good point. You know, half of our military budget goes into the coffers of these private military contractors. At Code Pink, we ask members of Congress to sign a pledge that they will not take any money from the top 5 military contractors: Raytheon, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing. And we are experiencing some success with Congress members signing on, because we do see a correlation between the money they take from the military contractors and their votes in Congress.
All right, Marcy Winograd, thank you so much. Pleasure to have you. Now, whether it's to do with arms production, weapons exports, or other military matters, U.S. defense spending has ballooned to astronomical levels in recent years. The rise has been particularly steep in the past 20 years, increasing by more than double since 2000, when defense spending stood at $320 billion. In a global context, the U.S. spends more on defense than the next 11 countries combined. But could that money be better spent elsewhere? When Joe Biden requested over $700 billion for defense spending in April, he asked for only $133 billion for health and human services and little over $100 billion for education. And though Biden's Build Back Better plan earmarks $1.75 trillion for social and climate spending over the next decade, military spending is expected to exceed $8 trillion during this same 10-year period. So can military spending that so massively dwarfs social spending be justified? My next guest, Lawrence Korb, is a former Assistant Secretary of Defense. He is a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Lawrence Korb, there is still a pandemic raging here in the United States that has already killed over 800,000 people. Does it make any sense for Congress to now pass a defense bill that increases military spending by this much when there is another far more threatening health issue facing Americans today?
Well, it didn't make sense for the Biden administration to submit such a large budget or the Democratic-controlled Congress to pass it. In fact, before Biden took office, General Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, basically assumed we would be cutting military spending to deal with the problems caused by the COVID.
But that hasn't happened. And this isn't the Cold War. The U.S. has withdrawn from Afghanistan. The Biden administration has kept on saying that it is winding these forever wars. Yet, as you say, Congress has given the Pentagon more money than the president asked for. Isn't this a prime example of the military-industrial complex at play, the colluding interests driving policy?
Well, I think it's a combination not only of the military-industrial complex, because Congress added money particularly to build more ships than Biden had requested. But it's also, I think, the Democrats are afraid to be seen as soft on national security. And if you go back and you look historically, when you want to cut the defense budget, you need a Republican in power. If you look at the last time we made significant cuts in military spending, it happened under Richard Nixon. Nixon got us out of Vietnam, cut military spending significantly, and put the money into things like the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, Amtrak. He had a healthcare plan that was more radical than Obama had.
Well, and we keep hearing about the threat from China and Russia, whether it's real or imaginary. Does any of this justify the bloated Pentagon budget? You yourself said there is no perfect security. In fact, in a letter that you sent to a member of Congress just a couple of months ago, you wrote this. You said, when it comes to the budget, it is important to remember that no matter how much this nation spends on defense, it cannot buy perfect security. If there is no perfect security, then why spend so much on defense?
Well, basically, what happened was, again, if you look at the Democratic Party platform, they accused President Trump of fiscal irresponsibility when it came to defense spending. He raised it in his 4 years in office by $100 billion. And what's also troubling is where the money is going. Biden has basically embraced Trump's nuclear policy and wants to modernize all three legs of the triad and build tactical nuclear weapons, which are going to hurt arms control negotiations with Russia, which is really the greatest threat you have to deal with, which is nuclear weapons.
Well, hold on. Isn't this a bit of a red herring, though? I mean, you mentioned where the money's going. It's no secret that top-level U.S. government officials have served on the boards of major defense companies. including the current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and the current Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and so many others. But these two both worked at a private equity firm that invests in defense companies. I know you yourself went through the revolving door between government and the defense industry, as have many before you as well. Isn't that part of the problem? The reason why the US is spending so much on defense, because of this cozy relationship between defense contractors and the government.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. You mentioned me. I got fired after 2 months because I wouldn't defend some of the positions the Pentagon had at the particular time when I was asked to testify before Congress. The Pentagon complained to Raytheon and they fired me. In fact, the case went to the Supreme Court, but that's a whole other issue. But you're quite right. I mean, you have Secretary Austin was on the board of Raytheon. Mark Esper, who was his predecessor, basically ran Raytheon's Washington office. So yes, there should be a limit as to the revolving door going in and out of the Pentagon.
Going back as well a couple of decades to the Reagan administration, more than a couple of decades, you served within that administration at the height of the Cold War. Even when the numbers are now adjusted to inflation, the US is spending more today than it did during the Cold War on average in real dollar terms. In fact, $200 billion more in real terms than during the Cold War. And in 2020, the US spent 10 times more on defense than Russia, 3 times more on its military than China. Again, does it make any sense for the US to be spending so much, to be in fact spending more than the next 11 countries combined on defense?
8 of whom are our allies of the next 11 countries. No, it doesn't. And I think this is something, for example, the Biden proposed a defense budget this year of roughly $760 billion, and the Congress added another, 25. You could easily cut it to $700 billion. In fact, I have done proposals over the years to show how you could do that without endangering national security.
But even $700 billion, that's still quite a sum. Does it have to be that high?
Well, again, you got to start from where you are, okay? And so if you're at 750 or 770, to go down to 700, I think makes sense. And this is something the Progressive Caucus in the Democratic Party has advocated for, Senator Sanders, Congressman Pocan, and basically was part of the Democratic platform.
All right, Lawrence Korb, thank you so much for joining us. The $650 million arms deal with Saudi Arabia that some members of the US Congress recently tried to block will replenish Riyadh's arms supply. Member of Congress Ilhan Omar said that supplying Saudi Arabia with weapons for its war in Yemen was, quote, unconscionable, while her colleague, Representative Ro Khanna, said he could not support a bill that fails to end US complicity in the bombing of Yemeni civilians, asking if that was really the best the US could do. But US involvement in overseas wars, both directly and indirectly, is of course nothing new. From Vietnam and Cambodia to Iraq and Afghanistan, the involvement of the military-industrial complex and defense appropriations move in tandem. Wars need arms, arms need wars. It's good for business. But can this nexus change? To help answer this, I'm joined by Gordon Adams, a distinguished non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and the co-author of the book, Buying National Security, How America Buys and Pays for Its Global Role and Safety at Home. Professor Adams, you've studied America's national security and defense budgets for many years. What does this latest increase in congressional funding for defense tell us about America's military priorities?
Well, I think it tells us more about America's political priorities than our military ones, frankly. The Biden administration proposed a budget increase of something just above inflation, about 1.7% real growth. And the Congress on both sides of the aisle decided the most appropriate way to proceed was to increase it by 5%. So it's actually 5.4% increase over the rate of inflation, which is much more than President Biden had actually originally asked the Congress for. And it tells us that politicians on both sides of the aisle want to look tough. It's especially important for the Democrats.
But is it about looking tough? Why throw in that additional $25 billion? Is it justified in any way?
I think it's rather badly justified. The Christmas tree, if you will, the rhetoric on which this increase is being hung is China-Russia. American foreign policy attention has clearly swung to East Asia and the Pacific and to the various confrontations that are happening with the Russians. But frankly, most of the things that are bought in the defense budget that was put forward are going to appear 2 or 3 or 4 years down the road. They're not actually things that are going to happen now. So they're a front-end investment in technologies. This really is a political issue, and it goes way back to 1972 and to the struggle over the war in Vietnam and the George McGovern campaign against Richard Nixon. George McGovern was defeated quite badly by Richard Nixon. I think he carried a state or two, maybe Massachusetts. But that was all. And the Democrats decided at that point, for the most part, and there's some disagreement with this, that they never wanted to look soft, as they would say, on national security again. So this year, the Republicans have put up a big fight arguing that the Democrats pulled out of Afghanistan, are soft on national security, aren't doing what's needed to confront China. There's several bills pending in the Congress on China. And the Republicans are in a full-bore effort to take over the House and the Senate in the 2022 election. So the Democrats, in a defensive move, have basically said, well, okay, we'll go way up on defense, and then you can't turn around in the campaign and say we're soft on it.
But is this about the Democrats not wanting to appear soft on national defense, which could be part of this? Or is it more to do with the entrenched military interests that underpin the economic and political structures of the United States?
There is no question in this country, I actually wrote a book about this years ago called The Iron Triangle. There's no question that the defense industry, the Congress, and the Pentagon have been for many, many years in league with each other to keep levels of defense spending high. It doesn't necessarily mean $25 billion more is simply the result of the pressures of that industry, but the fact that the defense budget is high and hard to cut actually is a reflection of that larger relationship between the industry, the Pentagon, and the committees that decide on this in the Congress.
The military-industrial complex, what many people call the war profiteering. How do you curb all of this spending, much of it unnecessary, many would say, when so many high-ranking former and future U.S. officials serve as lobbyists for major defense firms like Raytheon, like Lockheed Martin, sit on their boards?
I would argue that it's almost impossible to do. The only times that the defense budget goes down in America is when the United States leaves a war and when there's a bigger budget fight going on.
And if that is the reality and these are the dynamics and the trends continue, how do you hold the Defense Department accountable for its spending? Because the Pentagon has never passed an audit. They failed the 4 that they've had. Their first one, in fact, was in 2017. Even though audits had been a requirement since 1990. Why wasn't the Pentagon audited for so long?
You have to see how big a complex an organization the Pentagon really is. They do 15 million contracting actions a year in the Department of Defense. They have over 300 or 400 financial and accounting systems across the services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Missile Defense Agency, the Office of the Secretary. Getting all of those pieces aligned is, first off, a bureaucratic, tough task. Secondly, very few people outside of the Pentagon actually understand how it works. One of the reasons that this budget increase is what it is because the people who make the decision are on the Armed Services Committees, and they know how the Pentagon works.
Professor Gordon Adams, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
If you want peace, prepare for war. This old Latin adage, tested by time, may simply mean deterrence in today's plain English. In ancient or modern times, it is a theory that has been central to any army in the world, large or small. It is also central to America's military and political doctrine. The U.S. has been engaged in war after war, military adventure after military adventure, not to mention covert and proxy wars. The truth is that war is good for business, a dire reality that President Dwight Eisenhower forewarned his people about decades ago. The rise and misplaced power of a military-industrial complex, a hidden hand in U.S. politics. That was 60 years ago. It still is the case today. The quote, immense military establishment and large arms industry that the 34th US president warned about today comprises not only the military and defense industry, but also the US Congress, which, rather than curb the business appetites of defense contractors, is actually fueling them. And these appetites, these business models, simply put, need wars because, like any business, selling is the name of the game. So in short, it shouldn't come as a surprise to any of us that this year's US defense budget is shockingly high, both in domestic and international terms, with the US accounting for over a third of the world's defense expenditures. And yet, what is also shocking is that just a handful of maverick lawmakers are able to see another plain reality: how a pandemic, an invisible pathogen, can threaten the US more than the specter of a Chinese threat in the Pacific, a China that spends about 1.7% of its GDP on defense compared to the US's 3.7%. How the world's military superpower was pushed back, if not defeated, by a ragtag army in Afghanistan after 20 years of war, and how even a $770 billion defense budget would not have changed that outcome. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, from the entire team here in Washington. Thanks for watching.